All right. So we've done cardiovascular and going to move into the respiratory system. And the reason that we do the two systems back to back is because they go hand in hand. Neither one of them can fully do their job without the other one. And so they're kind of considered to be sister systems, complementing each other to make sure that they can complete the entire cycle that they need to within the body. So that first page, functions of the respiratory system, just talks about some of the very basic things. And I mean, most people are somewhat familiar with their respiratory system to where they would be able to kind of come up with these ideas on their own. Ventilation is just the taking in of air as well as the removal of air from the body. You have external respiration, and external respiration is the taking in of air and the movement of air through the body before it actually gets into your bloodstream. So any movement of air in your body, but not to the blood itself, is actually going to be considered external respiration. So when you draw air in and it goes into your nose, into the trachea, into the bronchial tubes, until it crosses that barrier and actually is dissolved into your blood, that is considered to be external respiration. So transfer or movement through the tube structures of your respiratory system is external. Transport of gases. And with the respiratory system, everybody focuses on the oxygen. We know that we need oxygen in order to survive. But in actuality, the removal of carbon dioxide is just as important as getting oxygen into the system. So getting oxygen delivered to the cells of your body, every single living cell has to have access to oxygen. And so it has to run very close to blood vessels in order to be able to pick up and absorb some of that oxygen out of the blood. And then you have internal respiration. Internal respiration is when the blood actually transfers from the lung structures into the blood. Once it's made it into the blood, that is then considered to be internal respiration. And then the last one is cellular respiration. The oxygen being delivered to your cells, and it's been a long time since we talked about the process of cellular respiration, but we talked about the electron transport chain. It was the third part of cellular respiration. And with the first two parts of cellular respiration, you had two ATP molecules being produced. So glycolysis and Krebs cycle, they each produce two ATP molecules. ATP is the energy source for your cells. Electron transport chain produced between 30 to 32 ATP molecules. And the reason that you see such a vast difference with glycolysis and Krebs versus the electron transport chain is because of the fact that with the electron transport chain, this is where oxygen actually becomes involved. And oxygen is such a powerful molecule that it makes the process of producing those ATP molecules that much more efficient. And that's why we see such a huge jump in the ability of that electron transport chain to actually produce ATP molecules. We also talked about your liver and your muscles actually having adapted to be able to produce up to 34 ATP molecules. But that oxygen getting delivered to your cells being able to use it, really makes that cellular respiration more efficient. All right, flip over to page 2, the parts of the respiratory system. Parts of the respiratory system is divided into basically two different categories. You have an upper respiratory tract and you have a lower respiratory tract. And with your upper respiratory tract, you have the nose as well as the nasal cavities, the sinuses, and then the pharynx. The pharynx is the space where your nose and your mouth actually come together. So all of those upper structures are going to fall into that upper respiratory tract. You hear somebody say that they have an upper respiratory tract infection. The infection is actually going to be in one of those 4 areas. Then with the lower respiratory tract, You have the larynx, which is generally referred to as the voice box. The trachea, which many people will refer to as the windpipe. That is actually going to transfer air down into the lungs. The bronchial tree, which are the subdivisions of the trachea. And then the lungs themselves, which are the location where gas exchange actually takes place, and that oxygen makes its way into your blood. Looking at page 3. Page 3 talks about structures of the nose, and this picture is going to kind of pop up several times throughout the packet. I'm going to go through most of them right now while we're looking at this page. But like I said, with some of the other structures, you'll see this image pop up again. Now, the first thing that I want to identify is the frontal sinus, and then you have the sphenoidal sinus that shows up on the other side. Those are both cavities that you have within the bone structure. And one of the things that those sinuses will do is they actually reduce the weight of the bone. But they also play a very important role in sound production. As air is leaving your body and you are forcing it out, the air is actually going to hit those two cavities or sinuses that you have within the bone. And as air hits those open spaces, it resonates off the bone, and it actually is what's going to give somebody the pitch or their tone to their voice, part of it. And it's why you can close your eyes and hear somebody talk and you can kind of recognize who it is. Because even though everybody has a frontal and a sphenoidal sinus, the exact location of them and the exact size of them is going to vary from person to person. So when you combine that with the length of their vocal cords, it's going to give people their unique tones to their voice. Now, both of those sinuses are going to be lined with mucous membranes, and when you're healthy, the mucous membranes are not overproducing mucus. Those cavities will remain empty, and you hear your voice normally. If you are sick, have allergies, something of that nature, those mucous membranes will start to overproduce mucus, and those two cavities will actually fill with mucus. So now as that air is leaving your body, it hits off of those, it doesn't resonate the same, and that's why we associate that different sound to your voice when you're sick, is because of that. Just below the frontal sinus, you have the nostril. This would be the area where you draw air into your nose. Just below that, you have the hard palate, which if you take your tongue to the roof of your mouth, you can feel your hard palate. The hard palate is actually the divider between your nasal cavity and the mouth. So it forms a barrier between those two locations, and it actually is going to be used in the process of digestion to help kind of form the food before you swallow it. Just below the hard palate, you have the uvula. The uvula is a little flap of skin. If you've ever looked at the back of your throat, you've probably seen the uvula hanging down at the back of your throat. And it's attached to skeletal muscles. And what will actually happen is when you swallow, those skeletal muscles will contract and that uvula will swing up. And it actually closes off that opening to the nose. And this ensures that whatever you're trying to swallow doesn't go up into your nose. Unfortunately, because it is controlled by skeletal muscle, it's somewhat easy to confuse at times. So if somebody makes you laugh, or if you start to cough, or something happens and that muscle doesn't contract right, the uvula will stay open, it won't cover that space, and you'll have milk or water or something coming out of your nose, which most people have experienced at some point in their life. But that's why, is because that muscle didn't fully contract, it didn't cover that space, and what you were trying to swallow and get to go down now came back up. Just below the uvula, the next one you have identified there is your tongue. Some scientists actually argue it is the strongest muscle that you have in your body, if you don't take size into consideration. Then you have the hyoid bone. Hyoid bone is the only bone that does not form a joint with any other bone in the skeleton. It actually is anchored and held in place by the bottom of the tongue, so those lower muscles as well as some ligaments will help hold that hyoid in place. Tucked just below that hyoid, you have the larynx, which is known as the voice box. The voice box is a structure that is largely made up of cartilage, and this is to allow it to have the flexibility that it needs in order to be able to deal with all the movement and help aid in sound production. And we'll get a little bit more into that a couple pages from here. And then just below the larynx, you have the trachea, which is the windpipe. Now, you do have two tubes at the back of your throat. You have the trachea, and then tucked just behind that, you have the esophagus. The positioning for the two tubes doesn't happen by chance. There is a reason for it. The trachea is actually designed to have cartilage wrapped around it, not 360 degrees, but a good portion of the trachea is going to have these cartilage rings, and that helps support and keep the trachea open. The esophagus does not have that for a couple of reasons. Number one, when you swallow a bolus of food, that typically is a large amount of food that you're trying to get down, the esophagus will actually expand to accommodate that bolus of food. So having cartilage rings around the esophagus would not be very effective. So the esophagus is just tucked behind the trachea. It gets a little bit of protection from the trachea, but it also is expandable to accommodate the food that you're trying to get down to your stomach. On the other side, at the top, you have the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. And you can see it kind of looks like bumps that you have on the inside of your nose. Actually, what they are is they're scroll shaped. So it's a structure that's actually folded over itself. And we see this several places in the body where you take something and you fold it over or you roll it. And actually what your body is trying to do is it's trying to get as much of something into a very, very small space. And so by taking those nasal conchae and rolling them over themselves, basically what you're doing is you're increasing the surface area, and lined all along that scroll-shaped structure is going to be another place for mucous membranes. Also, some of the receptors that help in the aid of smell are going to be within those locations as well. Now, we don't have the greatest sense of smell, but it would be a lot worse if we didn't have that scroll shape that allowed us to increase the surface area somewhat. Sphenoidal sinus we already talked about. And then I'm actually going to get into the tonsils. There's three sets of tonsils there. You have the pharyngeal tonsils, the palatine tonsils, and the lingual tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsils, most people probably have heard these referred to as adenoids. They are the most superior of the tonsils. And they are designed to help deal with any foreign particles that you would inhale when you breathe in and out through your nose. There are a lot of things floating around in the air that we draw into our bodies, and that's just located so that as that air is making its way down to your lungs, you're going to have part of your immune system right there to deal with any foreign particles coming in. And then you have the palatine tonsils. The palatine tonsils, you would have one on the right and left side of your throat. These are the ones that you actually can see. So when you become sick, you look at the back of your throat, and people say that they can see their tonsils are swollen up. Those are the tonsils that they are actually viewing. And then you have the lingual tonsils. Again, you have one on either side of the tongue. They sit at the back side of the tongue, and so usually do not see them. People will have their tonsils removed if they get a large number of infections, and doctors kind of use a guide on how many infections you have to have within a certain time period before they'll consider taking out the tonsils. I believe right now 5 within a year would create a candidate for having your tonsils removed, and then I forget what the numbers are on down from there. But once you hit that 5 within a year, then they'll start thinking about removing those tonsils if the need arises. Don't necessarily have to remove all the tonsils. That's another thing that will kind of vary. So you might have one set of tonsils taken out, but not necessarily all of them. And that's kind of doctor discretion and patient by patient based, depending on what's going on when they get their infections.
We remove the tonsils in the adenoids, but never the in general.
What's that?
We remove the pharyngeal and the palatine, but not the. I never remove the lower tonsils.
I know they try and do as little as they possibly can. when they remove them. So if they can get away without doing a set or a couple of them, yeah, we'll leave them. Then you have the divisions of the pharynx. And again, the pharynx is a space that, it's not an actual structure. It is just a space where the nose and the mouth come together. You have the nasal portion, which is the superior part, closest to the nose, hence the name naso. Then you have the oral section. This would be directly behind the mouth, or to the posterior side of the mouth. And then you have the larynx division, and this is actually right on point with where your voice box would be. So it's all one area or one location, but just to kind of give you an idea of exactly where you are within the pharynx, they'll use those prefixes. Next one that we have is the epiglottis. Epiglottis is another flap of skin that you have in your mouth region. It actually is going to cover either the esophagus or the trachea, depending on what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to swallow food, the epiglottis will lay over the trachea to make sure that the food does not go down into your windpipe. If you are trying to get air in, the epiglottis covers the esophagus to make sure that the air goes into your lungs and not down into your stomach. Again, just like with the uvula, it can get confused. If you have the hiccups, somebody again makes you laugh, that uvula or that epiglottis will stand straight up and it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't cover either one of the tubes. And that's when you run the risk of getting food down into your trachea. Getting food into the wrong tube is more of an issue than getting air into the wrong tube, unless you're intubating somebody. You just take in some air and it goes down into your stomach, you're going to end up burping in the next couple of minutes and the air comes back up. But with food going down the wrong tube, the risk that you run is actually it becomes lodged in the windpipe. And in that case, you're actually going to block off their ability to get air down into their lungs, and that poses a very big problem. Okay. Now, are you from Sioux City? No. Okay. We had, it's probably been about 14 years ago, I think it was in 2000, a gentleman started choking at Outback and excused himself when the table went into the bathroom. It never came back. And he actually ended up choking to death in the bathroom. And so they say, you know, some people get embarrassed and they kind of want to remove themselves from the situation because they're coughing and making a big scene. But you want to stay kind of visual in public. You also, a lot of people will start patting somebody on the back if they're choking and coughing, and they think that that's a nice thing to do. But as long as you can hear air moving, you don't want to do anything. Because if somebody's choking and they're trying to work the food back up, if you start hitting them on the back, you actually can push it down the wrong way, and you can help lodge it. So as long as they're moving air and they're able to talk, you don't want to do anything. At the point you hear no air movement, that's when you want to intervene and start helping them in some way, shape, or form. Sounds kind of mean, because everybody just that natural reaction to start patting them on the back, but if they're moving the air on their own, leave them alone and let their natural devices do what they can. And the esophagus we've already talked about. Now, these next pages will go a little bit faster because we've covered quite a bit of this already. Following page goes over the pharynx. And I mentioned a couple times already, but just to recap very quickly, the pharynx is not an actual structure. It is simply where the nasal cavity and the oral cavity meet and come together. So that region, and you just have the three divisions, high, middle, and low. The page following the pharynx is the structures of the larynx. And with the larynx, this is the voice box, and you can see how it kind of sits right on top of the trachea or leads down into the trachea. I already mentioned that it's primarily going to be made of cartilage, and cartilage offers support, but at the same time it offers flexibility. And so it has a very unique design. And you find it in places where you need to have that feature. So where you tend to have moving parts, you're going to have that cartilage to give you the flexibility as well as the structure that you need. Looking at some of the cartilages that you have. First one that I want to point out is the thyroid cartilage. And the thyroid cartilage, right in the middle of it, it has kind of a V-shaped notch to it. And that kind of makes it easy to pick out. Thyroid cartilage is actually the largest piece of cartilage that you have within the larynx. And the thyroid cartilage at start, so when you first develop, it's actually two individual pieces of cartilage, and it will eventually become fused together. Most people would refer to this as the Adam's apple. And when we talk about an Adam's apple, we typically think of what gender?
Yeah.
Typically associated with males. What they've actually found is that your thyroid cartilage, when it fuses together, those two individual pieces become one. Testosterone levels, which are higher in men actually set those two pieces of cartilage to be a little bit sharper. So in men, when these two pieces fuse together, they actually fuse together at a 90-degree angle. And so they sit out further in the male throat. In women, we do have testosterone, but in much lower levels. So the angle at which those two pieces of cartilage set is a little bit softer. It's 120 degrees. And because of the wider angle, it's able to sit further back in the throat. Is there a top view on there? Not really the thyroid cartilage, but they're fused together at the front and then they're open at the back. So with that 90-degree angle, it's much sharper and projects more out of the throat. With the 120-degree angle being a little bit wider, it's able to sit further back in the throat. But that's why we associate Adam's apple as being a male characteristic, even though females have the thyroid cartilage as well. The other piece of cartilage that I want to point out is the cricoid cartilage. Now, just a minute ago, I mentioned that your trachea has cartilage rings around it. And if you were to look at an aerial view of your trachea, the front side of your trachea would be rounded, and the back side of the trachea is almost flat. Kind of looks like a D turned on its side. And that's because the cartilage rings that you have do not run 360 degrees around the trachea. They only run about 3/4 of the way around the trachea, and that leaves the esophagus tucked in there behind, so that when you swallow food and that esophagus has to deal with that food that's going down, it's not up against those rigid cartilage rings. It allows for a little bit more flexibility. Now, the cricoid cartilage is the one exception to that rule. Cricoid cartilage is the only piece of cartilage that makes a full 360-degree ring around the trachea. So it's there to offer support, hold the trachea open, but it does have the unique characteristic of being the only piece of cartilage that runs completely around the trachea. Every piece of cartilage after that is only going to go 3/4 of the way around.
So it's at the top of the trachea?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's why when the CRNA asks for cricoid pressures, because of American food, so they can see that.
Have you got to be a part of that?
Yeah.
Have you?
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought that would be neat.
Mm-hmm.
To be part of that. The next one that I want you to find is the arytenoid. It's over here.
Yeah.
Actually, we can do the cuneiform too. Both of those are going to be cartilages that are going to offer support to your vocal cords and your supporting ligaments. So the thyroid, the cricoid, the arytenoid, and the cuneiform. Those are the ones I want you to be familiar with. All right. Flip over to the trachea. And I've kind of run through the trachea. It's hard not to get into some of the other structures while you're talking about something else. So we've hit on a lot of the points for the trachea. Typically referred to as the windpipe because it does transfer air from the mouth and the nose down to the lungs themselves. It is one tube. So you just have the one tube that is transferring the air. Once it branches and becomes two different tubes, then you're into the bronchi. I want you to know that the cartilage is there to offer support, but it does not run all the way around the trachea. If you like to sleep on your stomach, that cartilage comes into play, because without that cartilage, the pressure from your pillow would actually close off your trachea. So that cartilage helps keep it open so that your airway is not easily restricted. When they have someone in forensic science that they believe was strangled, one of the things that they'll look at is the hyoid bone and those cartilage rings that you have around the trachea, because the hyoid is typically broken and those cartilage rings will typically be broken as well if that was the manner of death. Size-wise, you're looking at about 2.5 centimeters wide and about 12.5 centimeters long. Again, that's an average. It will vary slightly from one person to the next. But it's going to be housed just below the larynx and just before the bronchi. Now, once the trachea branches and becomes two tubes, those are your bronchi. One of them will dive down into the right lung, the other one will dive down into the left lung. Now, with the bronchi, as it moves down into the right lung, the right bronchi is actually a little bit shorter in nature and a little bit wider compared to the left one. And the reason for that is the distance. Remember, the left lung is actually a little bit smaller than the right lung to make room for the heart. So because of the positioning and because of that left lung being set over to make room and accommodate that heart, we do see that first branch off of the trachea, that primary bronchi, being a little bit longer on the left-hand side. So the bronchi take air from the trachea and continue to move it down into the lungs. When we get into the CAT dissection, we will do some work with the lungs. You guys will open them up and take a look at them, and you'll actually be able to see all these little tubes as they make their way through the lung structure. Now, with the branching of the tubes down into the lungs, a lot of times it's referred to as a bronchial tree, and it's actually an upside down tree. But you have the trachea, which would be the equivalent of a trunk. And then as you move up the tree, and like I said, this is going to be upside down, but you have your main branches that come off of the trunk, those would be your bronchi. And then as you continue to move down into the lungs, those bronchi are going to branch and become smaller and smaller, smaller and smaller, and then we eventually get down into the bronchioles. Now, the divisions that you see, you have a right and a left primary bronchi. Those are the bronchi that are coming directly off of the trachea. And you have one going to the right lung and one going to the left lung. Once those primary bronchi get down into the lungs, they are going to divide again, and those are your secondary or your lobular bronchi. On the right-hand side, you are going to have 3 divisions. On the left-hand side, there's just 2. And the reason for that number difference, that you have fewer secondary bronchi in the left lung, is again for that size difference. Left lung is smaller, doesn't have as much capacity So it doesn't need as many of those original divisions. From there, you go to the tertiary, or the segmental bronchi. And every time we make a branch, it's just getting smaller and smaller. With your tertiaries, you are going to have 10 branches on the right-hand side, 8 on the left. Then you get down into the bronchial tubes. The difference between bronchi and bronchioles is simply size. Once you get down to a certain size, then they're classified as bronchial tubes. Still transferring air deeper and deeper into the lung tissue. So with that interlobular bronchi, you're going to see 12 in the left lung, 14 branches in the right lung. And as you continue to divide and get smaller and smaller, the numbers increase. When you get down into your terminal bronchioles, you're looking at hundreds. You don't get really an exact number. Respiratory bronchioles, they average around 6,000 to 7,000. And then those tubes keep breaking down and getting smaller and smaller. And at the end of your bronchial tubes, you're going to end up with a structure known as alveoli. And alveoli, we have a very good picture of on the following page. They actually look like clusters of grapes that you have at the end of the bronchial tubes. The alveoli are air sacs that you guys have. The membranes that make up the alveoli are so thin that the oxygen molecules are able to diffuse across them, as well as the CO2. Now, when you get air down into the alveoli, for the oxygen and the CO2 molecules, this is actually what the membrane of the alveoli looks like. So for those oxygen molecules, the spaces are large enough that the oxygen can simply pass right through. That's how thin the membranes are. For your blood and things like that, there are molecules that are too big. They wouldn't be able to pass through those holes. But for the oxygen molecules and the CO2 molecules, they are able to just move right through these cells of your alveoli membrane. So the oxygen is going to move out of the alveoli into your bloodstream, and then the carbon dioxide would work the other way and come from your bloodstream, pass into the alveoli, and the next time you exhale, you would force that carbon dioxide out of your body. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But just so you can see what those alveoli look like, little clusters of grapes, they're basically air sacs, and they are so thin-walled that oxygen and CO2 is very easily able to diffuse across the membranes. Now, the little outtake picture that you have there, the alveoli are actually going to be completely covered in capillaries. And that is actually so the blood runs right over the alveoli, and that exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen can easily take place. Capillary walls are just like the alveoli walls, very thin in nature, easy for the gases to exchange or pass through them. Next page. Within your lungs, you have in the neighborhood of 300 to 350 million alveoli. Again, depending on the text that you guys see, you will see a wide range of numbers on this, usually between 600 and 700 million alveoli within a lung. That is more than enough to last you a lifetime, because just through natural wear and tear, you will break the alveoli, but you are born with the number of alveoli you will have for your entire life. So once they break and rupture, they are done. There is no repairing them. And people that live in highly polluted areas actually will rupture and break their alveoli at a higher rate than people living in places that don't have high levels of pollution. Smoking is obviously going to be a huge indicator on the health of alveoli. People that suffer from emphysema, they've actually broken so many of their alveoli that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the body becomes very, very difficult for them. So once you break alveoli, there is no repairing them. The number of alveoli that you have within your body can actually, if you were to open them up and lay them out, actually can cover about the equivalent of a standard tennis court. So if you think of how big a tennis court is, if you were to take out all those alveoli and lay them out, you would be able to cover that much space. And again, pretty amazing that you can take that many of something and pack it into your lungs or your chest cavity. Okay. The following page, basically what you have here is this top lighter gray area. This would be your alveoli. And the darker gray that you have here is going to be a capillary. So it's just showing you that relationship of the alveoli wall and how the capillary just runs very, very close to it. Now, it's been a long time since we talked about diffusion, but the process of diffusion, things moved from an area of what concentration to what? Do you remember? High concentration to low concentration. So if you look at the numbers there, it's showing you the concentration of CO2 in your alveoli compared to oxygen. So inside your alveoli, you have 40 millimeters of carbon dioxide and 104 of oxygen. In your blood, you have 45 of carbon dioxide and 40 of oxygen. So you just told me that things are going to move from high to low. If CO2 is 40 in the alveoli, 45 in the capillary, it's going to move from your blood into the alveoli. For the oxygen, higher in the alveoli, lower in the bloodstream, so the oxygen is now going to diffuse into your bloodstream. This is how you replenish your oxygen supply within your blood. The amount of oxygen in your alveoli is always going to be a higher concentration than in your blood, so the movement is always going to go from the alveoli into your blood. Likewise, carbon dioxide should be higher in the blood because as the blood's coming back to the lungs, remember, it's just circulated through your body. It's been collecting and picking up carbon dioxide, waste product from all the cells of your system. So carbon dioxide levels are going to be very high by the time it gets back to your lungs. Carbon dioxide levels in your air that you're breathing in should be lower. Therefore, the carbon dioxide will diffuse out. You exhale, that carbon dioxide leaves your body. But it all just is on the basis of diffusion, which says things will move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. All right. Last one that I want to get through very quickly are the lungs themselves. Actually, we're going to do one more. But the lungs are the gas exchange organs. They typically have a rounded cone type shape to them, or triangular shape to them. So narrow at the top, wider at the base. I've already mentioned a couple times that your size difference between your right and left lung. Right lung is going to be larger in size than your left lung. It actually has 3 lobes to the left lung's 2 lobes. And all of that is by design just to make room for the heart. Now, the lungs are dependent on a muscle called the diaphragm. And just below your lungs, you have that diaphragm muscle. The diaphragm muscle will contract, and when the diaphragm muscle contracts, it's actually going to pull on the lung, and it's going to force the lung to open up. Now, the actual act of breathing is not you actively inhaling air, but if you flip over to breathing mechanism, the very last bullet on that breathing mechanism page says that the relationship between pressure and volume is opposite. So as pressure increases, volume decreases, and vice versa. And this is the very concept in which the movement of air in and out of your body works. It's balancing the pressure inside your body against the pressure outside your body. You sitting in the classroom right now, you have atmospheric pressure pushing on your body. You might not feel it, but it's there. And the inside of your body is always pushing back with the same amount of force. As long as those are kept in balance, you are just fine. If your inside starts pushing out with more than the atmosphere pushes down, what happens? Think of a bomb.
Breathe out, you can't.
But it's just your body as a whole. If you start pushing out with more pressure, what does a bomb do? It explodes. So if the inside of your body started forcing out with more than the atmosphere came back with, you would explode. Divers can only go down so deep because the pressure of the water becomes so great that if the pressure pushing on them becomes more than what they push back with, they would implode. So the act of breathing is going to work on that same concept. So that diaphragm contracts, opens up the lung. The lung now is going to increase in volume. So what happens to the pressure? When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes, so the lung closes down on itself. So the volume decreases. What happens to the pressure? So it's actually happening when you breathe. When you see yourself inhaling, that lung opened up. The air had to rush in to fill that space to keep the pressures inside and outside your body balanced. Likewise, when you exhale, what's actually happening is the lung is collapsing down on itself and that air is being forced out of your body. When you have the hiccups, that diaphragm muscle is having a spasm. And when that diaphragm muscle spasms, it contracts very quickly. The lung pulls open very quickly, and that air has to rush in with a lot more force than it typically does. And that's why you hear the sound associated with the hiccup. It's just a spasm of that diaphragm muscle. Okay. Now, sitting next to my sink back there, is a empty pop bottle. It should have been rinsed out, I'm not sure. What I want you to do with that pop bottle is go ahead and you can use either a razor blade or you can use scissors. Go ahead and cut the bottom 2 inches off of the pop bottle. Don't need the lid, don't need the wrapper. You can clear all that off of it, but just take the bottom 2 inches off. You can either puncture it with a pair of scissors and cut it off, or you can take a razor blade and cut a section into it. Yep, that'll work.